Imagine living in a place where every single car is white, where the loaf of bread bears the name of the ruler, S mother, and where you have to read the regime's holy book just to get a driver S license. It sounds like a joke, but it really happened. Today we're going to find out which government deserves the trophy for the worst dictatorship on the planet. Does North Korea still sit on the podium, or is there an even darker corner somewhere in Central Asia? Stay with me, and I'll show you the numbers, the bizarre stories, and of course your verdict at the end. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button, because this topic deserves every bit of attention. Before we slap labels, let us recall the 4 pillars we already defined on this channel that turn any government into a dictatorship. First, a supreme leader who controls everything, even if his power is mostly symbolic. Second, virtually no political rights elections, if they exist, are staged. Opposition is either banned or a paper-thin facade. Third, civil liberties are gutted, no free press, no free assembly, no free speech. Fourth, repression or a cult of personality, either brute force or propaganda that makes the ruler seem like a semi-divine figure. If a regime checks all 4 boxes, it already has the dictatorship stamp. Now we'll compare who does it in the most brutal way on the planet, but to decide which one is the worst, we need criteria. I've built 5 indicators that will apply to every case. Write them down. Human rights violations, murders, torture, forced labor, economic control, monopolies, runaway inflation, state-engineered famine, international isolation, sanctions, blockades, total censorship of foreign information, cult of personality, statues everywhere, mandatory holy books, renaming of everything after the leader, longevity and stability, how long the regime has persisted without a real transformation. The regime that scores the highest across all 5 indicators will be the front-runner for the worst dictatorship trophy. Now, let's meet the contenders. First up, North Korea, human rights violations. The infamous Gwaliso prison camps, public executions, chronic famine that kills tens of thousands each year, economic control, perpetual crop failures, about 40% of the population living below the starvation line, isolation, virtually zero external internet, tourism strictly staged, only a handful of approved visitors, cult of personality, the 3 Kim Il-sung, Jong Il-jong unhab gigantic statues. Jukki functions as a state religion, taught in every school. Longevity, 75 years of totalitarian rule from 1948 to today, uninterrupted. Next, Turkmenistan. The regime born with Sapar Mohot Niyazavan, continued by the family, human rights violations, forced labor on cotton farms, political prisoners, even children conscripted to pick cotton, economic control, near total dependence on natural gas, unemployment spiraled to 70% in 2015 when gas prices collapsed, isolation, only 10,000 tourists per year, heavily filtered internet, the run of the state's Bible mandated in schools, driving tests, and even in prisons. Cult of personality, Niyazov crowned himself Turkmen Bey, renamed weekdays, months, and even bred after himself and his mother. Massive marble imports from Italy, statues up to 8 meters tall, all recorded in the Guinness Book of Records. Longevity, independence since 1991, but the most authoritarian phase lasted 15 years under Niyazov, followed by a continued autocratic rule under the Berde Mohammedo dynasty. Now on to Syria. Under Bashar al-Assad, human rights violations, chemical weapons use, systematic torture, forced disappearances, entire cities bombed, economic control, civil war destroyed infrastructure, millions of refugees, a shattered economy, isolation, heavy Western sanctions, yet the regime still leans on Russia and Iran for support. Cult of personality, the Assad family is portrayed as the nation's guardian, with constant propaganda in state media and school curricula. Longevity Ba'athist rule since 1963. Bashar in power since 2000, more than 20 years of open conflict. Next, Venezuela, led by Nicolas Maduro. Human rights violations, political prisons, extrajudicial killings, violent suppression of protests, economic control, hyperinflation exceeding 10,000% per year, chronic shortages of food and medicine, isolation, US and EU sanctions, but still receives aid from Cuba and Russia. Cult of personality, Chavismo turned into a permanent revolution, with symbols of the past glorified in squares and on flags. Longevity, Chavismo since 1999. Maduro in power since 2013, roughly 10 years of acute crisis. Lastly, ruled by Isaias Afwerki. Human rights violations, imprisonment of journalists, forced labor at border work camps, arbitrary economic control, a militarized economy, high unemployment, scarcity of consumer goods, isolation, no free press, almost no international flights, effectively a closed country. Cult of personality, the president is constantly referred to as the father of the nation, with public events centered on his image. Longevity, independence since 1993, 30 years of authoritarian rule. Now comes the part everyone's waiting for, the comparative analysis. We'll give each regime a score from 0 to 10 on each indicator, then add them up. Regime, human rights, economic isolation, cult longevity, North Korea, 9-8-10. 10-9 Turkmenistan, 7-6. 8-9-7, Syria, 9-7-6. 7-8, Venezuela, 6-9. 5-5-7, Eritrea, 6-5-9-6. Quick result: North Korea leads in almost every column, followed closely by Syria on the violence front, but it falls short on total isolation. Turkmenistan boasts a cult of personality almost as intense as North Korea's, yet its economy is far more fragile. Venezuela shines as the economic collapse champion, while Eritrea's greatest strength is isolation, though its violence score is lower. However, the weight of each criterion isn't equal. The sheer intensity of North Korea's cult of personality permeates every school, museum, even UN speeches. In Turkmenistan, the Runama was even launched into orbit as propaganda. When we sum everything, North Korea still carries the trophy for the worst dictatorship. Why do these dictatorships survive so long? For pillars sustain their durability. Information control, war gas, iron fist, internet, mandatory bukso. The population only receives the official version of events. Militarized repression, loyal armies, paramilitary units that silence dissent before it can spread, strategic resources, gas, oil, minerals that keep foreign powers interested and fund the regime despite sanctions. Cult of identity, renaming streets, rewriting history, inventing external enemies. This builds a forced loyalty that feels almost involuntary. These four foundations create a vicious cycle. The tighter a regime clings to them, the harder it becomes for citizens to break out. How could change happen? Scholars point to a mix of international pressure, targeted sanctions on the regime's financial core, and internal pressure, organized dissent, mass protests, yet without a viable economic alternative, the populace stays trapped because there's nowhere else to go. In North Korea, the only real cracks are energy sanctions and information leaks, clandestine smuggled USB drives with forbidden films. Meanwhile, Turkmenistan has begun to feel China's weight as its gas is rerouted there, giving a thin negotiating margin that opposition groups could exploit. So, what is the worst dictatorship in the world? By total score and accumulated suffering, the short answer is North Korea. But remember, every regime on this list carries its own brand of horror, and they all remind us how fragile freedom truly is. Now, I want to hear from you. Is there another regime you think deserves a spot on this list? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, information is the first drop of freedom.